Welcome to Chapter 12. In Chapter 11, we looked at some issues regarding managing human resources at a global level, specifically in managing parent country nationals and expatriates. In this chapter, we'll focus more on managing host country nationals. When multinationals locate in other countries, they very often hire host country nationals and third country nationals. They need to be able to effectively recruit and attract these employees that they need who have sufficient skills or the required skills. They have to be able to identify the talent among local employees, train the employees to make sure that they are capable in doing the job, and question whether the methods they use for training in the home country would also work well in the host country. Multinationals need to focus on performance management. For example, asking themselves what types of appraisal methods are customary in the host country, and can we implement our own performance management methods in this context? Multinationals have to be aware of appropriate rewards and the reward structure, what rewards would be appealing to host country nationals, and finally, multinationals need to adapt their operations to the local legal environment. For example, what types of laws influence their ability to staff, compensate, and train the employees that they need. In Chapter 3, we discussed many aspects of the national context, like the education system. It's important when a multinational enters a new nation to be aware of the local variables that might influence the availability of the labor pool as well as the skills of the labor pool. The educational system in a particular country is going to influence the access that a multinational might have to an educated workforce and the training needs that the multinational might need to put in place. The legal system and the cultural expectation in selection will also influence the practices that the multinational is able to use. For example, in the US, it's illegal to discriminate based on gender, but in Japan and Korea, it's the norm that men work outside the home and women stay at home and raise children, and mothers who hold managerial positions often face bias. Multinationals need to consider the types of jobs favored by applicants. For example, in Japan, people have a preference for working for large corporations. Of course, the local laws and cultural expectations regarding fair wages and promotion criteria. For example, in the US, which is an achievement-oriented society, pay for performance is very popular. But in other societies, ascription-oriented societies, status and seniority might matter more. And finally, laws and tradition regarding labor practices. For example, relationships between labor unions and management, which we'll discuss at the end of this chapter. A multinational might decide where to locate a subsidiary based on the availability of human resources and physical resources, like raw materials, capital, or supporting institutions available in a particular society. The nature of labor relations, for example, the historical relationship between labor unions and organizations or employers, might also be a determining factor whether or not a multinational would choose a particular country versus another. Let's look at some of these specific aspects of human resources across cultures. Let's look at recruitment first. In recruitment, a multinational wants or needs to determine what jobs are available, how many jobs need to be filled, what skills are necessary for each job, and the objective in recruitment is to generate a large enough pool of qualified applicants to select from. In the US, managers are frequently recruited via online or print advertising. There's great emphasis on quality and formality in recruiting. Open and public advertisements are considered most effective in the US. This is reflective of the US's individualistic culture. There's great emphasis on avoiding discriminatory language in job ads. In other cultures, for example, collectivist societies, recruiters and employee referrals are a lot more popular. There's some concern in the US with employee referrals because those sometimes result in hiring people of similar backgrounds when friends refer friends, and that might result in bias against some underrepresented groups. In collectivist societies, referrals, also known as backdoor recruitment, are very popular. And there is an expectation that if an individual is in a position of power to offer employment to others, that he or she would do so. And the practice of referring friends and family to one's current employer is very common. This might mean that if a multinational from an individualistic society like the US came into a collectivist society and tried to use the same open public advertisements to recruit a pool of applicants, they might not be as successful. Because in collectivist societies, job seekers know that there's preference for referrals and therefore might reach out to family and friends asking for job leads. And that's what companies might prefer in the local context. Another difference between the US and other countries, the US is a low power distance society, but in high power distance societies that put a lot of emphasis on status, managers are frequently recruited from prestigious universities. To summarize, recruitment and selection in the host country needs to be aware of and adapt to local practices. If local norms are not followed, the multinational may not get the best employees and may offend cultural norms or break host country laws. Multinationals can shape, or the multinationals' approach to recruitment and selection can shape applicant perceptions. For example, cultural factors can influence the degree to which candidates feel that the selection process was fair and equitable. Potential employees who go through the selection process will develop an idea of how fairly they were being treated, and this might shape their decision as to whether they want to work for the multinational or not. Individuals who feel that they are fairly treated might develop a more attractive view of the organization. That's especially important when employers, multinationals, are competing for best talent in the host country. Another important aspect that multinationals need to consider are the training needs. This would be determined by the level of skill and the education system available in the host country. The training and development needs will vary greatly by country, industry, and technology. Differences in training and development needs are driven by differences in education system. For example, percent of high school graduates or percent of university graduates and availability of vocational schools. Also, the emphasis on training placed by national governments is going to differ greatly. For example, in Germany, there's a well-established and extensive apprenticeship program, which makes professional employees more readily available than in other countries. Finally, cultural values regarding other personnel practices, for example, lifetime employment norms in Japan, could create different perceptions regarding personnel practices in training and development. In the United States, employers invest significantly in training, especially in management development and computer skills. Unfortunately, only about 1 in 14 US employers provide training. There's greater pressure on US businesses to supplement the basic educational training. But the transition to a service sector economy means that specialized skills in training will increase. One of the challenges in the United States is that about 30% of US students do not complete high school, and many of those who do finish high school lack sufficient reading and mathematical skills, which puts a lot of pressure on employees to supplement with training. The service sector requires employees to have both technical skills as well as soft skills like critical thinking, team building, and learning ability. As mentioned earlier, Germany has a very strong emphasis on vocational training. In Germany, companies are required by law to provide vocational training to workers in exchange for tax benefits. This way, the costs of training are shared between companies and the state, resulting in a well-trained labor force that has non-company specific skills and can more easily move across organization. This is one of the reasons why Germany has such high quality technical products, because it has ample supply of well-trained technical experts. The collaboration between industry and government also makes employers more likely to invest in training. In other countries where governments are not as involved, employers might be reluctant to invest as much in training because there's no guarantee that employees will stay with them. To summarize, many multinationals, before selecting a host country to expand into, would consider the availability as well as quality of host country nationals to fill both laborer and managerial positions. The choice of entering a new market will be partially determined by this availability and by the need to supplement with additional training, which obviously involves additional cost. Host country national managers' training will be based on the scope of their jobs. If a company, a multinational, has a multi-domestic strategy with polycentric human resource management strategy, they are likely to train host country managers for country-specific skills because their job duties will be just for their own market. This would happen in multi-domestic multinationals or multinationals pursuing a multi-domestic strategy and a polycentric approach to human resource management. Human resource approach in companies that use a regional or transnational strategy would be quite different. Host country nationals in those type of companies might be groomed to become part of a global cadre of managers and be prepared and trained to move to other locations worldwide. This would be applicable within a particular region for multinationals using a regional strategy, or worldwide for a multinational using a transnational strategy. And so these types of host country nationals who work for these types of multinationals might be trained according to standards dictated from headquarters and socialized into the corporate culture more intently to prepare them for global jobs rather than jobs in their own countries. Performance management is another important aspect of effective human resource management. In the US, performance management is deeply rooted in the individualistic nature and the universalistic nature of US culture. There's great emphasis on the performance appraisal being rational and fair. There's emphasis on comparing performance to objective standards and making sure that equal rights and equal opportunities are granted. Also, the US, as we discussed in Chapter 2, is a low context culture, which means that performance evaluations will be given directly to the employee, communicated directly in a face-to-face or written communication with the manager. In other societies, performance appraisal might be delivered very differently. For example, in Japan, poor feedback is communicated when the manager ignores the employee. This is part of Japan being a high context culture and much of the communication happening non-verbally. In collectivist societies, feedback, praise, or punishment is often provided from peers within work teams, which serves to shape behaviors and does not require direct feedback from the manager. In collectivist societies, sometimes managers would communicate feedback through intermediaries to avoid disrupting harmonious relationship or causing loss of face. Performance management is also very often tied to compensation. Compensation, as we discussed in Chapter 11, includes a lot more than take-home pay. It also includes incentives like bonuses, benefits like medical insurance or paid vacation, as well as retirement contributions. In the US, there is great emphasis on both external and internal variables. External variables refer to wage rate comparisons, comparisons with wage data within a particular industry or a job category. This is due to the high mobility of workers in the US labor market. And an opportunity for a promotion, more pay, or advancement is valued more than loyalty to one employer. This is the external aspect of the compensation. The internal aspect refers to the importance or the relative importance of the job to the organization. The more essential an individual's contribution are to the organization's overall success, the more likely it is that this individual will have higher pay. Most firms in the US look at comparative wage data to determine their own compensation within their industries. There are some differences in compensation. For example, pay for performance is not going to be popular in a high uncertainty avoidance society. In Japan, aspects like marital status can determine pay decisions, where individuals who are married and have a family might receive higher compensation. But overall, if we look across different countries, there is more convergence, more coming together, more similarity in pay practices around the world. And there is agreement that pay incentives are important, that pay should be contingent on performance. Incentives should be a significant amount of pay. Job performance should be the basis for pay raises more so than seniority or age. Benefits are important, and benefits should be more generous. Pay should be based on long-term results. Multinationals might operate in different countries that have different norms regarding pay. And so they have to adjust their pay practices to what is the norm or common in a particular host country. Multinationals must also match their performance evaluation to their multinational strategy, as well as their compensation to their multinational strategy. Many multinationals seek location advantages in countries with low wages, like many developing countries in the Asia-Pacific region or in Eastern Europe. This is a relatively short-term competitive advantage because wages are rising and it is becoming increasingly difficult to retain workers who are poached away by other multinationals. A final important consideration refers to labor relations. One important aspect for multinationals to consider is union member density. This refers to the proportion of workers in a particular country who belong to unions. Overall, in the US, union membership has declined considerably, although there is some resurgence. You might have heard on the news with Amazon and Starbucks workers trying to organize. The relative presence of labor unions in the US is declining. The point of this discussion is not to get you to learn about labor unions and labor density in all countries around the world, but rather to understand that labor unions across different countries are quite different, and that might shape the ability of multinationals to pursue their strategies. It might also determine whether a multinational chooses to enter a particular market or not. If a particular country is characterized by very conflictive labor management relations, this might be a reason for a multinational to avoid a particular country or particular region of the country. For example, Japanese companies in the US are more likely to be located in southern states that are less supportive of labor unions compared to northern states where unions are more prevalent. Some of the differences across countries are rooted in cultural differences and historical factors, as well as ideological reasons for establishing unions. And this would obviously also shape how management in particular countries view unions. For example, in the UK, there's been a historically adversarial relationship due to the lack of government involvement in the early days of labor union creation. Government was hands-off in resolving labor disputes, which created a confrontational and adversarial relationship between management and labor. In Germany, possibly given to the high uncertainty avoidance level in that country, there is a more formal, legalistic, and low conflict, centralized bargaining between large unions and large companies. The government was involved in the early days of union creation and served as an intermediary. Germany has work councils that negotiate working conditions directly with the employer. And industry unions negotiate wages at the national or regional levels. Work councils are German employee groups that share plant-level responsibility with managers on issues like working conditions. This is a very unique situation in Germany. In France, labor unions were relatively late to develop compared to other countries, and the unions in that country tend to be more militant with anti-capitalistic perspectives. In the US, the right to organize and bargain collectively exists since the mid-30s, mostly on bread and butter issues like wages, benefits, working conditions, and historically the relationship between labor unions and employers in the US has been driven by conflict. In Asia, there's great variation across countries with different types of unions, which we'll see in a minute. India also has relatively strong unions. A multinational might select whether or not to enter a host country based on the union member density proportion in that country and the nature of labor relations in that country. Countries don't just differ in terms of labor density, but also in terms of types of unions. Some countries have enterprise unions. These are common in England and Japan. These unions represent all people in one organization, regardless of their occupation or location. Craft unions represent people from one occupational group, such as plumbers or electricians, and those exist in many countries around the world. Industrial unions represent all people in a particular industry, regardless of occupational type. Those exist in Australia, Belgium, and other EU countries. A local union might represent one occupational group in a particular country. An ideological union represents all types of workers based on some particular ideology or religious orientation. For example, in Israel, there is a union that represents workers in various industries: education, sanitation, transportation, government workers. And that union has become so powerful that it can paralyze the country until its demands are met. Other countries might have white-collar or professional union, which represent particular occupational group. It's just similar to a craft union. The point here is not to memorize which country has what type of union, but to see the great variety in terms of labor unions that exist in different countries. To summarize, multinationals need to be sensitive to different levels of union importance, union density, and the structure and bargaining climate. As I mentioned earlier, multinationals may select a particular host country based on union density and nature of their relationship. For example, many European multinationals select countries in Eastern Europe where labor conflict is lower. It's important to recognize that multinationals have a lot of power. They have significant financial resources. They often have subsidiaries in many countries, which means they can suffer losses in one location and sustain a strike for an extended period of time and still be profitable in other locations. Many host governments don't limit the actions of multinationals because they want the foreign direct investment and the employment that those companies bring. Developing countries sometimes have weaker labor legislation and fewer laws in place to protect worker well-being. And sometimes multinationals can even lobby with host governments to change labor legislation in their favor. For example, McDonald's was able to get labor legislation adjusted in New Zealand to enable it to have workers working particular shifts with fewer breaks. Labor unions are quite limited in their ability to influence large multinationals, mostly because the locus of control is so far. These multinationals are headquartered in countries that are far away, and there's limited access to decision makers. There is some cross-border cooperation among unions. For example, Hyatt workers in Jakarta were striking and were supported by Hyatt workers, Hyatt hotel workers in New York City, who were picketing in front of the Hyatt in New York City to draw attention to poor working conditions in Jakarta. But this is the exception rather than the norm. Most unions don't have cross-border collaboration ability.